We've just met the work of B.F. Skinner, who introduced one particular kind of way of approaching behavior, in which behavior was modified using what he called the operant conditioning. This is a reward or punish schedule, and Skinner was very aware of context. Now we'll address now a rather more famous, probably, case of behaviorist research, which is very different. This was the work of Ivan Pavlov, who was awarded the Nobel Prize for this work. Now, Pavlov was not a psychologist of any kind. He was a physiologist. He was interested in the inner workings of animals' bodies. But he was also interested in how behavior is modified in animals. Again, animals, not people. And he introduced a paradigm known as classical conditioning. So operant conditioning belongs with Skinner. Classical conditioning is Ivan Pavlov. And you've probably heard of this experiment. You start off with a dog which you assume has some kinds of behaviors built in or naturally occurring behaviors. And then what you do, the way he typically did it in his experiments, a hungry dog will salivate when it knows food is coming. Right? It'll produce saliva and begin to drool. And a bell means nothing to a dog, normally. But if you repeatedly pair the presentation of food to a hungry dog with the sound of the bell, well, the dog's not stupid. It's going to learn. And what it's going to learn is that when that bell rings, here comes the food. And so Pavlov set up a set of experiments in which it was demonstrated that ringing the bell does nothing to the dog. Producing the food causes the dog to salivate. And after a series, many days in which the food is paired with the bell, then comes the crucial moment when you ring the bell, but there's no food there. And the question is, will the dog salivate? And the answer is yes. Now, Pavlov's interpretation of this introduces two terms which are extremely important: stimulus and response. They're so familiar and they've gone into our everyday vocabulary that we forget, first of all, that they belong here in a classical conditioning paradigm, and also that they're very, very problematic. I'll try to illustrate just what the problem is here, and we'll discuss it further in class. But here Pavlov is thinking along these lines. Pavlov thinks that the bell is a stimulus and that the salivation is a learned response. So the unconditioned stimulus is the food, because the dog salivates in the presence of food at the start of all this. The conditioned stimulus is the bell, because it only becomes a stimulus through this repeated pairing. Now, Pavlov won the Nobel Prize for this, and people saw something very profoundly important in this, because it seemed to suggest how we could learn by association and how things that are originally meaningless in the world could become more meaningful through exposure, through mere coincidence. Here you can see Pavlov's fine team and one of his dogs. Now I'm going to just hand over and let an old character called Heinz von Förster tell a story about a Polish scientist called Chomsky. And Chomsky did a replication of Pavlov's work. And I want you to pay attention to this story because it illustrates what the problem is with calling something a stimulus and calling something a response. This is a very important point. So Heinz von Förster, who's the old geezer there on the right, is talking to Umberto Maturana.
Fascinating experiments to establish the intelligence of animals. I think the most beautiful thing is the Pavlov studies to getting the conditioned reflex thing going. Yeah? He had a dog, putting a dog on a table, and there was an assistant in a white coat. The assistant showed the dog a piece of meat, and when the dog looked at it, of course, he was looking forward. He salivated, a lot of saliva was coming up, and then the assistant rang a bell. Okay, very good. They do this 10 times, and then the assistant enters the room, rings the bell, and the dog salivates. This was for dog, the proof of conditional reflex. The dog can transfer the ringing of the bell to the meat without being even shown the meat. An act of symbolization. Mm-hmm. And of course he got for that the Nobel Prize. A Polish experimental psychologist said Pavlov wrote his experimental conditions so well in his lab books that I can repeat his experiments exactly as he carried it out. So Chomsky did exactly the experiment. The lab assistant with the same white coat, the dog at the table next to the window, a bell standing next to the table, assistant going with the meat, with the bell, meat and bell. And now comes the experimentum crucis, where no meat is shown, but only the bell is around. Chomsky took the clapper out of the bell without the assistant knowing that. So assistant goes in, grabs the bell, no sound is coming out, but the dog salivates. So Chomsky concluded the ringing of the bell was a stimulus for Pavlov, not for the dog.
Not for the dog.
But unfortunately, he didn't get the Nobel Prize for that.
No.
Everybody was a bit...
So, it's a really interesting thing. He replicates the experiment with one difference, which is that there's no sound, but the dog still salivates. So obviously the logic with which the original experiment was being interpreted is somewhat misleading. Now we'll discuss this in class, but I want you to pay attention to what von Förster says there. The bell was a stimulus, but for Pavlov, not for the dog. Now, stimulus and response are terms used even today in contemporary cognitive psychology widely, and their problematic nature needs to be properly understood. So we'll discuss this one a bit in class. Now, we'll also discuss the work of a third behaviourist, John Watson, which is profoundly depressing work. And behaviorism as a school of thought ran out of steam shortly after the Second World War. A lot of people who wanted to engage in something called psychology were not happy with this at all. The whole notion of experience has got left behind. That was one of the founding motivations for developing a science of psychology. So this just becomes behavior science, which is not quite the same thing. And it treats human, you notice all the work is on animals, and they've been treated as machines. And so you end up with a very mechanistic view of the human spirit in which we look more like puppets responding to stimuli than like the creative, wonderful, angelic beings that we quite obviously are. It had no place for all the richness of our mental lives, our dreams, imaginings, hopes, fears, emotions, what have you. And its notion of learning was very, very impoverished. Learning, or the modification, acquisition, modification, and extinction of behaviors, that's a very narrow way to approach our being in the world. And inevitably, those currents of inquiry, those motivating questioners who had established a science of psychology were ultimately going to be unhappy with this. And things came to a head in the 1950s when Skinner, who we met in the last video, approached a topic that seems to belong to the human rather than the animal. He approached language, but he didn't call it language. He called it verbal behavior. He's Skinner, after all. And he tried to take the way he thought about animals and apply it to consideration of how humans acquire and use language. And basically, Skinner was making an argument that to speak English is to have a set of behaviors which allow you to respond appropriately during an English conversation. Boom. Along came a junior academic at the time, whose name was Noam Chomsky. And this is right around the time that we're going to see a huge shift in all the contributing disciplines to cognitive science. Here we've got the behaviorist tradition, but it comes under critique from a linguist. Chomsky is an early linguist, and he jumps in and he writes a scathing critique of Skinner's approach, pointing out how Skinner can't even begin to address the topic of language, how a behaviorist approach is totally inadequate to account for how children learn language. After all, they don't meet sentences and then regurgitate those sentences. In fact, children meet a really weird kind of language. People talk real funny to infants. Look at the little baby, he's got his daddy's nose. And from this, somehow they learn language. And furthermore, most sentences are creative. They're not simply replications. So Chomsky had a devastating critique of this book, and that forms, it's a landmark at which we're going to look, everything that happens after this point, around 1960 more or less, we'll see the cognitive turn. And this is going to come from all kinds of directions, from philosophy of mind, from computer science, from linguistics, and it's going to give rise to a new kind of psychology. And we'll begin looking at that in the next video.